it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ariel James. So Ariel first got interested in cognition and language when she was at Stanford University, where she got her bachelor's degree in psychology in 2011. She then went on to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign for her PhD in cognitive psychology, where she worked primarily with Dwayne Watson on questions surrounding individual differences in language comprehension. In particular, she was interested in how people's experience with language, both recent and habitual exposure, and their cognitive abilities like working memory, impact online language processing. Throughout grad school, Ariel was really passionate about teaching, and after her PhD, she won a prestigious Wallin postdoctoral fellowship to teach and conduct research at Macalester College. This clearly went really well because they hired her soon after that, and she's now an assistant professor in psychology at Macalester. So I was lucky enough to get to know Ariel and her work during grad school. We were both at U of I and working on similar things. And I've always admired Ariel because she asks really deep theoretical questions with important real world applications. And she also takes the time to really get the methods right no matter what domain she's working in. So her current work is focused on the measurement issues that are particular to the study of individual differences, which is at the intersection of correlational and experimental research. And I think this is some of what she is going to tell us about today. So thanks and welcome, Ariel.
Thank you, Rachel. That was very nice. I'm like all caught me off guard. I mean, not that you're not usually nice. It's just, you know, okay. I thought it was just going to be biographical. Okay, sorry. Here we go. Hi, I'm Ariel. And so I'm going to be talking about individual differences in syntactic processing. This is work that was like the foundation of my dissertation work. So what Rachel was saying about looking at individual differences in sentence comprehension and working on methodological problems, this has all of that in there. So I'm going to try to just, you know, talk through all the different pieces here, individual differences, what kind of syntactic processing, and what I mean by the two disciplines problem. Oh yeah, I also want to say that you can interrupt with questions if you like, and you can also, like, you know, chat them, and I'll try to remember to pause and be like, does anybody have questions? But I just keep in mind, I can't see anybody and I can't see the chat. I can really just see my slides, so, but I know you're there. Okay, so let's start with individual differences. Oops, there we go. So individual differences just means that we're not all the same, and this is something that when I was like first learning about psychology, and we learned about how, you know, people do experiments and then they have to kind of average over subjects. I was always like, oh, but the average, then you don't know what the individuals did. But you need to do that to do experiments. And it's like totally fine and cool to do that. But there are also sometimes interesting individual differences that we are not looking at. And so, for example, we can take a classic experimental paradigm and think about, okay, what's sort of the average effect that we're interested in, that we think of as being sort of like the universal underlying phenomenon, and then think about, okay, if you scale back and look at all the different individuals, is that interesting or not? So a classic example is the Stroop task, usually used as a measure of inhibitory control, sort of originally interested in kind of how people process like language and different symbols and things and how that is automatic. And so on one side, we have the easy condition where all you have to do is just name the color that you're looking at. And so if you have good color vision, you just look at the boxes and say what color it is, versus in the hard condition, you have to still say the color that you're looking at, but you get all this interference because you really, really want to read the words, even though you're not supposed to for this particular task. And so if you're looking for a Stroop effect, you can look and see, okay, how much slower are people when they are doing the hard condition versus the easy condition. And so now I'm going to show you what that looks like on average based on some data I have. So I have the easy condition on one side, which is faster, it's just under a second, and then the hard condition is on the other side, and it's a little bit slower than a second. So it's this little Stroop effect. And this is something that like has been replicated a bunch of times, that people are slower in the hard condition. But now let's look at, what if you put everybody's easy average and hard average on the map? So it looks like this. And so you can see that there's, a general trend of being slower, so higher in the hard condition, but that things are kind of smeared out in the y dimension. So some people are just overall faster and overall slower, but they still have that same sort of upward trend where hard is slower. But actually, like, not everybody's doing it, so, or at least not doing it the same. So if we just pick out a few people, there's somebody that looks like they're just slow all the time. They're not any more extra slow in the hard condition. Somebody has a really steep Stroop effect. Some people are pretty fast, but they're just fast all the time. And someone even is like a little bit faster in the hard condition. So that would be like an opposite Stroop effect. That's pretty weird. So what we have just seen is that we're not all the same. But the question is that interesting? And if so, like, what does it actually tell us? So does this tell us something about individuals? Is it the case that the people that have different looking Stroop lines are actually different kinds of people that Stroop in different ways? And that's interesting about inhibitory control, for example. Maybe it tells us something about the Stroop phenomenon itself, that maybe it's, people generally Stroop, but it's not like a universal thing, and that's something useful to know if we're trying to build a model of whatever it is that underlies Stroop effects. Or maybe it just tells us something about measurement, that having people do this task and like measuring their response times is just kind of messy, and so we actually don't have a good measure of what people are really doing, and so we're bound to get some participants that just look kind of wacky. So observing individual differences in these experimental effects, like easy versus hard, could potentially tell us something about all three of these things. So the kinds of phenomena that I'm particularly interested in is also in the title. So syntactic processing. So people have looked at syntactic processing differences across individuals for quite a while now. I guess a kind of classic or foundational example is looking at differences in how people read these kinds of sentences that have certain kinds of relative clauses in the middle of them. And one panel has subject relatives, which is a relatively easier kind of relative clause to read. So the relative clause part is, okay, so at the bottom, you can sort of read, it's really little. The reporter that attacked the senator admitted the error. So that attacked the senator is the relative clause. It's telling you about which reporter we're talking about. And that's relatively easier than what we have on the other panel. The reporter that the senator attacked admitted the error. So that the senator attacked versus that attacked the senator. It's the same words, just in a different order. And predictably, predictably because people have done it a lot, maybe not predictably if you don't care about relative clauses, people slow down when they're reading the object relative. There's something about, okay, that the senator attacked, so like the senator is doing something to the reporter, but then in the whole sentence, the reporter is doing something about the error. Something about it makes people slow down, and they also tend to be less accurate when they're answering questions about it. The individual differences part is that in this study, they looked at, does your sort of reaction to these different clauses depend on how good your working memory capacity is? So they figure that maybe working memory is what kind of underlies why one of these is harder than the other one. And so the lines that I'm showing, one of the lines, the one that's always on top, has little L's for the low working memory capacity group, and then the H's are for the high working memory group. So high people are always faster, but then the lower people are slower, but they're like way super slower in the object relative case, particularly in that middle of the sentence. So this led to a conclusion that, okay, so if object relatives are kind of hard, and they're especially hard if you have low working memory, then maybe something about processing these clauses has to do with working memory. Okay, so in this sort of tradition of using individual differences as a way of trying to explain stuff about sentences, what makes them difficult, what sort of processes are needed, people have used individual differences in psycholinguistics in lots of other ways outside of these particular clauses or working memory capacity in particular. Generally speaking, I feel like the types of individual differences people are interested in tend to be things about like cognitive demands, just sort of general cognition-y stuff, like memory, like inhibitory control, being able to kind of keep straight which thing you're supposed to be paying attention to. Basic things like just processing speed or perceptual speed, like how quickly you can just like take in the information in the first place. And so there's evidence that you can predict things about sentence processing from measuring these sort of general cognitive abilities. There are also explanations that are more language specific. So looking at exposure to print, like how much you read, how much you like reading, how good you are at phonological processing, like being aware that things that are kind of rhyming, they do rhyme, but they're like different words, and being able to like parse those apart really good. So I'm putting these in like different areas of the slide because I've kind of made this false division. But you can also have a theory that all of those things matter, but then people sort of ask about, okay, in particular situations, what sort of will predict more of the variance, what seems to matter more. These are just sort of non-exclusive possibilities. Okay, so that's individual differences in processing. So I mentioned that there's a two disciplines problem. So I'm going to describe the two disciplines. So not psychology and linguistics, those are two disciplines, but there's no problem there. So the two disciplines are within psychology. This is based on a famous address that Cronbach, one of psychology's heroes, he gave an address to the APA in 1957. He's also written about it and given other speeches about the two disciplines of scientific psychology. And so here he's talking about the people that do experiments versus the people that do correlational work and like measure a bunch of stuff like personality, intelligence, stuff like that. And so he says that there's two different disciplines who are kind of running in parallel, doing their own thing, and they have different priorities. And so people that do experiments have an idea of what's an ideal experimental situation. So it's something where the behavior that you're interested in is something that's easily manipulated by some sort of treatment variable that the experimenter controls. So something like reaction time is something that can be manipulated by making something harder or easier. It's something that you're treating every participant, every subject as basically a replication. So you have people doing one condition versus the other one, or you have within or between subjects, either way. But then you're going to be looking at, okay, what's the difference based on the condition, not based on the individual person. So you're averaging over subjects usually. And any sort of between subject variation you think of as noise. Like, yes, I know that people are going to be doing different things, but I'm looking for the sort of central tendency that tells me something about how the manipulation worked. So in the other world, the other discipline, we have our ideal correlational studies, where the behavior of interest is something that is stable within individuals, not easily manipulated. So something like your personality, or your level of intelligence that we think of as like, this is a measured trait that is just a true thing about you. It's an aptitude. You're thinking of each subject as a unique object of study rather than merely a replication. They are a special snowflake. And so the between subject variation contains the signal that you're interested in. So person A being different than person B is interesting. And you're sort of trying to figure out why they're different. And so Cronbach describes these two different worlds and says, like, you all are doing your own thing, but you should really come together so that psychology can have the united discipline, because we need the best of both. So he says we should be investigating these aptitude by treatment interactions, so we can know for a given person in a given situation what can we predict? And so we drew a picture. And so this is how his picture looked. I'm going to kind of zhuzh it a little bit so that it's about my current situation. So in the middle, we have the organism at present, which we can call a subject or a participant. And the predicted response that we're interested in, for me, might be reading times, accuracy in answering questions about something you read. The past situations that I'm interested in might be something like language experience, so like how much people read. Psychometric information, so this is things like giving someone an IQ test or something. So they might be just these general cognitive abilities that I've mentioned, like memory capacity, inhibitory control. And then the present situation is just which experimental condition the person is facing right now. Are they looking at a difficult sentence or an easy sentence? And so using all of these things together, we have a much more rich picture that enables us to then make predictions. And so this sounds great. And so he's like, yeah, we should do this. But he also says it's a problem. Well, I said it's a problem. And that's because doing this kind of work where you're measuring a bunch of things about a bunch of people and then trying to, have them do an experiment, there are some just practical issues. So you need lots of subjects. You want to have a sample that has variability along all the dimensions that you're interested in. And you need lots of tasks. So if you're interested in a particular construct like memory capacity, there's lots of different ways that you can measure memory capacity. So it's good to have more than one that maybe have different sort of surface level flavors, but are all kind of measuring the same core thing of memory. So that then you can kind of, have some way of summarizing, maybe averaging or factoring together these different things and sort of just get the core sort of aspect that you're interested in. These tasks maybe need lots of items so that you have a good representation of every individual subject's performance. So it can be a very time-consuming sort of study to do. And then the key thing, and this is what I'll talk about most, is this thing, which is that experimental effects, so an experimental effect like a Stroop effect, easy versus hard, when we're using it as a way of assessing individual differences, like saying people have higher or lower inhibitory control by virtue of like how much they are Strooped, those effects need to be evaluated for measurement reliability, just like these psychometric, taking an IQ test or these things that were intentionally designed as measures of individual differences. And so because I've already set up how like the correlational world and the experimental world are different and have different priorities, it kind of leads to this clash. So this has been called, a related thing has been called the reliability paradox. So this is a paper by Hedge, Powell, and Sumner from a couple of years ago called the reliability paradox, why robust cognitive tasks do not produce reliable individual differences. Unfortunately, I'd already started this whole project before this paper came out. I'm foreshadowing, sorry, I don't want to get ahead of myself. So basically, let me just kind of describe what the situation is, the paradox. So for experiments, when we talk about a reliable experiment, we mean something that's replicable. And, a good reliable experiment is one where there's not going to be a lot of intersubject variation. It's where like, no matter what group of people you grab, as long as it's from the population of interest, like you're going to be able to find this effect. Versus in people studying individual differences, measurement reliability requires that there's going to be intersubject variation and within subject, like stability relative to the intersubject variation. So it kind of sets up a tricky situation. And I will return to it when we talk about the results of this project that uses experimental effects as sort of like the object of an individual differences investigation. So let's start. I'm going to talk about the study design. So this is a study that is a paper. So I have this picture to remind me to tell you that it's something that you can read if you want to get more details about the things I'm talking about. It's also so I remembered to mention my co-authors, Scott Frauendorf, Ankyung Lee, and Dwayne Watson. We all sort of converged at Illinois for a brief amount of time before scattering to other places, but they were all involved in kind of the thinking about this work. Okay, so in this study, we had 133 participants, a mix of people doing it for psychology credit and people who were paid. So most of the participants were college students, although some of them were older than college age and had more than completed college. They had like more education. And so people were reading sentences because we're interested in syntactic processing. I'll tell you more about those sentences in a second. And they were reading them in a self-paced reading paradigm where they're reading a sentence one word at a time, and they're hitting a space bar to see the next word. So we get a rough estimate of how much time they're spending at different points of the sentence. Then we gave them a bunch of tasks to measure different individual differences that might predict any differences we find in the reading times and accuracy in answering comprehension questions. And so there's 5 different constructs that we're interested in. We had a total of 16 tasks. Okay, so each of them had at least 2 tasks that we were using to measure that particular construct. I can tell you about the tasks if you're interested. I did not make slides for all of them because I figured I would spend too long telling you about the tasks, but I am happy to answer questions about them. Okay, so I'll tell you about the syntactic processing manipulations. So we looked to just find what are some kinds of sentences that are kind of tricky that people in psycholinguistics have looked at before as places where we expect to find individual differences that might be predictable from these different constructs that we're interested in. So language experience, memory, and all this stuff. So we settled on 3 sort of test cases that we see in the literature. So one is the relative clauses that I showed you earlier, the very exciting relative clauses. So the subject versus the object extracted in relative clause. The salesman who resented the cashier versus who the cashier resented. So that little manipulation makes one of them tend to be a lot harder than the other one on average. The next case is the use of verb bias on ambiguity resolution. So this one takes a little explaining. But so different verbs, like protested, tend to predict that the sentence is about to unfold in a particular way. So the verbs we were looking at were ones where they tend to be followed by just an object. So like you could say the students protested the plans. So like the plans are the object, like they just protested the plans. Or they can be, it's that the students protested that the plans for fall 2020 were dangerous. So in that case, it's like a whole sentence, basically. They protested this whole thing I'm gonna say. And so verbs vary in how often we expect them to just have an object versus have a whole long sentence thing at the end. And so if a sentence is gonna end up having that whole long sentence thing at the end, so like the plans for fall 2020 were dangerous, it's very helpful if you just have the word that there, because then it always means that there's gonna be like a whole sentence there versus, well, pretty much always. So you wouldn't say the students protested that the plans. So you know that by the time you get to plans that there's gonna be more stuff. Okay, so the question is, if you have a verb that predicts that there's gonna be a whole sentential complement, do you care whether or not the word that is there to help you disambiguate? Well, if you already knew what was gonna happen, then you don't care. But if the verb predicts, like kind of gets you to predict that it's gonna just end in a direct object, if you get the word that there, it's like really helpful because you were predicting it was gonna go, you would have predicted it was gonna go another way, but then it tells you like, no, it's actually gonna be a sentential complement thing. Cool, cool. So we're looking at the effect of this disambiguating word that based on what was the bias of the verb that came before. Okay. Last one is relative clause attachment ambiguity. So sometimes there's a relative clause, and we've already met relative clauses. So these little tidbits in the middle of a sentence that will give us more information about the noun, phrase, thing. But sometimes it's unclear who we're getting a little bit of tidbit information about. So in this sentence, the maid of the princess who scratched herself was deeply embarrassed. So who scratched herself is the relative clause, but are we talking about the maid or the princess? It's globally ambiguous because it's never resolved. So the reader just has to kind of decide. And since the readers in my case are just reading sentences in isolation, they have no information except for just like what they think seems good. And it tends to be the case that speakers and readers of English assume that we're going to use what's called a low attachment, meaning that it attaches to the thing that happened most recently. So the princess, in this case, it's closest to the relative clause. That's what we tend to expect. That's what unambiguous sentences, that's how they tend to attach, just to the thing that's like closer. And so people maybe have that expectation, but they might have that expectation to varying degrees, or even have a different expectation. They're like, oh, actually, I like it when the relative clause goes with the first thing because I like first things more. So we're seeing whether we can predict all of these different things, people's sensitivity to relative clause difficulty, verb bias, and how it interacts with ambiguity, and relative clause attachment preferences. Okay. So I'm just going to tell you what happens if we just look on average at how people reacted to these sentences, knowing that we're going to have to get to the individual differences because that's the interesting part for me. So across all subjects, we replicate these different syntactic effects from the literature, which is good. So on average, object relative clauses take longer to read than subject relatives. So that's the hard one is slower than the easy one. And they're also harder to answer questions about. We see a larger effect of ambiguity, so whether the word that is there, when the verb bias doesn't match what the syntax is. So it's very helpful when you get a hint when you would have been misled otherwise. And finally, overall, consistent with what I said before about English speakers liking low attachment, we found that the people in the study who were English speakers liked the low attachment. We established that we get these effects on average. Cool. But then the next questions are, is there between subject variability in these effects? So like, is it that some people think object relatives are really hard and some people think they're only kind of hard? So like, I had the Stroop thing where like some people were really strooping, some people were not really strooping, and some people were reverse strooping. So do we see that kind of thing happening with the syntactic manipulations? Because that's the experiment that we're interested in now. If we do see variability, then we want to ask why. And so we want to see whether all those subject characteristics that we tried to capture, did we capture the ones that actually explain some of the variability? So does knowing the working memory capacity or the language experience or whatever, does that help us explain why some people have different reactions to these manipulations? So first question first, is there between subject variability? So it's kind of there's different ways of approaching how to answer this question, and I'll spend a while talking about one of them. So there's different kinds of between subject variability. So one example would be, well, some people are just overall faster or overall slower readers. So that's cool. There could also be some people who are just overall better or overall worse at answering comprehension questions. But then there's also another kind of question, which is someone more or less influenced by the condition effect? So like some people are more sensitive to the whatever kind of syntax wackiness I did. So in terms of, say, a regression, then the first two questions are intercept questions. So if we have like our line showing the condition effect, this is just like moving the whole thing up or down to be faster or slower. But then the second thing is then about how steep that line is. Like, is it like easy versus hard, or like easy versus hard, or like easy versus hard? So a way of trying to ask whether or not we have variability at this intercept level or at this slopey level is by creating a model where we're trying to predict people's reading times or accuracy. and seeing whether or not, if we allow there to be random intercepts or random slopes for all the different subjects, so they can each have their own special line that's different from the mean, but like in their own special flavor, does that actually help the model? Or is it actually better to just assume that the only reason that people are different is just because there's kind of noise and they're generally just doing the same thing on average? So we asked, do random intercepts improve models predicting these different things? And yes. So when we're predicting reading time and when we're predicting accuracy in these different kinds of sentences, yes. You'll notice I'm just talking about verb bias in the subject and object relative clauses, just because of like a particular feature of the models for attachment preference. Because it was like we would ask a question, and if they said yes, for some of the questions it meant they liked high attachment, and for some of them it meant they liked low attachment. So the condition is actually which thing yes means. And so the outcome is just predicting whether or not they said yes at all. That's just like the plain regular outcome. And so some people just like saying yes regardless. So we're calling that a yes bias. And so there are sort of differences in people's just underlying yes bias. So it looks like there's meaningful individual differences in all of these things that I just said: overall reading time, accuracy, and yes bias. But what about the cool condition effects that like tell us some cool syntactic-y things? So do these slopes improve the models? Mostly no. So in predicting ambiguity effects, so whether adding that interacts with like the verb bias and stuff, or like just the verb bias by itself and like not looking at ambiguity and what kind of relative clause it was, having every subject kind of have their own flavor of condition effect did not improve the models. It was like, no, just assume that they're all the same, but you just are noisy. But in predicting attachment preference, yes. So now, whether people are going to say yes does depend on whether yes means low attachment or high attachment, and that is something that varies across individuals, such that it's good to have everybody have their own slope. It like explains the data better. Cool. Kind of. I mean, so like that one's cool, but like the other one's not cool. So variability in magnitude and sometimes direction of condition effects can just be noise. So like if we think about that Stroop plot where like everybody was all wacky bajacky, that would be like if we were looking at this data, but like all of that stuff just kind of was noisy noise. So here's another way of looking at sort of this: is there reliable variability between subjects? So here's a case that I just talked about as being like one of the good cases. So attachment preference, low versus high. So I'm going to plot for you for each individual person, if you took the odd trials versus the even trials, and for each of those halves, you subtracted how much they like low attachment from how much they like low attachment, the opposite. How much they like high attachment subtracted from how much they like low attachment. So having a positive value means they like low attachment more. So if you plot that, then you're just plotting each person against their own self, half versus half. It looks kind of okay, you know? So that's an indication that more or less people are consistent with themselves. So this is something analogous to sort of an internal consistency measure or reliability measure. It's really just a correlation between these two halves, but it gives you a rough picture of like, yeah, people are different, but they're kind of similar to their self. Good. But then when you look at, say, a different effect, so this is about when you're asking questions about the relative clauses, which part of the sentence are you asking about? Are you asking about the relative clause or the main clause? It doesn't matter. It's just a mess. Like, if anything, it looks like people are like negatively correlated with themselves. It's a mess. So that's just another way of looking at it. Okay, so in answering this question, so is there between subject variability? Yes, I mean, there is variability in that like different things happened, but a lot of it is due to within subject noise. But some of it wasn't, so we can be interested in that. So the second question, did we successfully capture subject characteristics that explain some of the variability? there's only so much we can expect now, okay? So as we're predicting reading comprehension, given everything we've seen so far, what can we expect to find? Well, if the thing that we're trying to explain is just kind of noisy and the variability just seems to be sort of random, there's not a lot that we can try to predict. There's nothing to cling to. And so if we think of it just as like, can we correlate people's reading time effect with their, say, Stroop effect or working memory score, if either of those has low internal consistency, in this case we're talking about the reading time effects having low internal consistency or reliability, that creates an upper bound on any correlation we can find between him and another thing. And so having low reliability is really bad. It just means that you can't find correlations. So I'm just preparing you for the nothing you're going to see. Okay. So in predicting overall accuracy, actually, no, I'm not preparing you for the nothing. I'm only telling you about the things that turned out to be something. And you'll notice it's just a short list given all the things that we measured. So in overall accuracy, just are people good at answering questions about things that they read, regardless of the kind of sentence that it was, even if it was a filler sentence, because we had filler sentences and people answered questions about them. So people that had higher language experience scores did better on comprehension questions. And like that's very intuitive, and that's good that we found that. So language experience was measured with like exposure to print, like how much people read, also vocabulary, how good people are at pronouncing irregularly spelled words, things like that. And so if I just, so we did this as we're predicting accuracy from all of the different individual differences constructs, and this is the one that predicted things. But here's a way of looking at it just as as if it were a correlation. So I have these sort of Z-score composite measures for each person's language experience, and then their average accuracy on the questions. And accuracy was like pretty high. So notice that the y-axis starts at 50%. So, I mean, somebody's down there, but other than that, they're doing pretty good. But there is also this sort of positive trend. Also, if I take out that one person who's doing bad, it still is a pretty good correlation. Okay. Perceptual speed scores predicted reading times overall. So regardless of the kind of sentence that we're talking about, people that have higher perceptual speed, as measured by like comparing patterns really quickly or comparing nonsensical strings of letters really quickly, they also press the space bar to advance the words in the sentences quickly. Again, that's intuitive, and that's very good that we found that. So here is another plot that's just showing it as if it were just a correlation. And so we have speed scores on the x-axis, and then the median RT on doing the self-paced reading. You'll notice again that there's like a couple, we'll call them oddballs, that have really good scores. And I suspect that they cheated. So I also have looked at, I ran the model without them, and it still works out okay. I can talk to you about this task later. I have things to say about it. Okay, but here's a cool one that has to do with syntax, okay? So lower working memory predicts a high attachment preference, and I'll show you what it looks like. It's a little more smudgy, but the higher and higher your verbal working memory score goes, the likelihood of endorsing a high attachment goes down. The way that I set it in the bullet is the opposite. So as you get lower and lower in your working memory, you're more and more likely to endorse high attachment. This is not intuitive, and it's neat. I'll talk to you about it again in a little bit. But so just quickly, high attachment again means that the relative clause part, so like the maid of the princess who scratched herself, you're attaching it to the thing that's actually further away. So the maid rather than the princess. And you would think like, oh, if that's further away and you have bad memory, like you don't even know that there was a maid, right? So how do you prefer that? Anyway, so we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, summary. So we ran a study with 3 syntactic processing experiments, the relative clause subject-object, the verb bias, and the relative clause attachment. And we wanted to assess individual differences in these different constructs. So they had 16 different tasks that they did, and then we made composite scores along these different dimensions. And the experimental effects, particularly the online effects, meaning as they're reading the sentence, the reading time effects, had pretty poor internal consistency, which then limited our ability to find any correlations with all the interesting things that we wanted to measure. I should also mention we looked at internal consistency of those other measures, and there's variability there as well. I can talk to you more about that if you're interested. But yeah, poor internal consistency, oh no. But also we did find a neat thing. So lower verbal working memory predicted high attachment. So I'll kind of talk through a couple of these things and what they might imply. So why is there low reliability in the online measure? So in the reading time measure, particularly not just overall are people, faster or slower in reading times, but particularly like the difference between one condition and the other condition as measured by reading times. So it could be like, is it just something about doing self-paced reading? Because self-paced reading is weird. I mean, people don't read sentences by like pressing a button to make words appear. So if you used a different measure that was more like natural reading and maybe isn't as like susceptible to weird artifacts of like button pressing, that it would have higher internal consistency. It's like tracking people's eyes or something else. It could also be that we're having a situation with the reliability paradox, or maybe these construction types that we picked because everybody likes to talk about them, maybe they're actually not ideal for being subjected to like a big individual differences study because they're like too robust. So like people, like the kind of underlying tendency across everybody is very strong, and then like individuals actually just don't vary that much. Just based on kind of looking at the spread of scores, I don't think that's so much the issue as I don't think the lack of like people varying enough is the issue. I think it's more the internal consistency issue, that there's too much noise within subject. That's just kind of based on looking at our data. Could it be that, we would be more tolerant of this kind of within subject noise if we did have a wider range of people? So our population, we sampled from just like college students and other like educated adults, but if we had a population that maybe had more variability in educational experience or other dimensions, then maybe we would have a wider range that would give us more between subject variability relative to within subject variability. And also it's just good to like do science with people that aren't just college students. So that we should just do that anyway. Also, it could just be that there isn't any low reliability. What do I mean by this? I think I meant that maybe there just isn't any variability. There isn't any reliability. I don't know. I don't know what happened. That's why there's 2 question marks. I don't know. I ran out of ideas. Okay. So what conclusions can we draw about measurement based on all the stuff I've just shown? I don't really know. So one of them is just still a question. So how do we, if we want to do a cool united discipline type of design where you're predicting people's reactions to experiments and you're also predicting things about them based on all these measurements, like how do you sort of optimize that sort of design so that you can give them a lot of tasks, but not too many tasks, so that like their performance goes down and that it's like impractical? Which sort of phenomena do you try to predict? Do you try to predict things that like have a lot of between subject variability? In that case, you don't want ones that are highly replicable. Going back to the reliability paradox issue. So that's just sort of a question of kind of how to prevent this from happening, basically. Another conclusion is that, power to detect things is, it's not just about having lots of subjects, which is kind of how I've always thought about power until recently. It's also about measurement quality. It's also about like how good you are at being able to have a good estimate of an individual subject's performance, which often requires lots of items, especially if you're just thinking about items as being kind of this like random sample of the possible sentences that a person could have seen. And maybe there are some tasks, sentence tasks, but also like, Stroop tasks versus other ways of measuring inhibitory control. Some of them are more robust than other ones. And so we should be picking the robust ones. And so that requires us to know which ones those are. Maybe there's ways of calculating scores differently than like the traditional ways of calculating scores. So ways to try to avoid just taking a different score as a person's summary of performance, things like that. Did we pick the right task to go with the things that we wanted to measure? So, I was interested in language experience, which is kind of a loosey-goosey concept. So we picked some tasks that seem language experience-y. But, that's just like kind of our guess as experimenters that like these tasks map onto this, I keep knocking this over, map onto this latent factor of language experience. But if any sort of like validity is compromised, like maybe actually this task doesn't really measure language experience that good, that's bad for measurement quality, and then that's bad for power and being able to draw good conclusions. So I think so far, this is all I've figured out, is that it's good to work together. So whether that means like pooling our resources so that we can collect enough subjects and have them like do really long batteries of tasks, or just when we're talking about measurements that we've used and we're reporting them, report measurement characteristics of them. Like, oh, I found that, in this situation with this population, with this type of method of implementing this task, this is the reliability I achieved. So it's good to keep reporting that, because reliability is like an empirical result. It's like reliability doesn't just like live with a particular task. It matters kind of the context that the task is being used. And so it's good to report that so we know to do a good study in the beginning instead of not until the end after we've done it. Okay, I told you I would get back to the neat finding, so that working memory was related to attachment preferences, but in sort of this not intuitive way, where people with lower working memory want to attach Who Scratched Herself to princess. No, not to princess. That's the thing you would think, because it's close by and it's fresher in your memory. But no, they attach it all the way to the maid. Like, why? So we're not the only people to find this. So some folks found this in study 1 of this paper that I'm citing here, that, oh, it's weird, like the low attachment seems to go with the high working memory people, and then the high attachments with the low working memory people. And so they did a second experiment because they expected that or suspected that maybe it was that people with lower working memory have a strategy of reading sentences in a way where they kind of break them up prosodically, so that they're in nicer, more manageable chunks to, go with their lower working memory. So they'll read it like the maid of the princess who scratched herself in public was deeply embarrassed. And when you have that sort of prosodic break right after that big noun phrase, it kind of favors thinking about the maid more than thinking about the princess for then what you're about to read in the relative clause. So then they manipulated this by kind of presenting the sentences in a way that mimicked this sort of prosodic phrasing, and then it made all the people kind of have the same preferences. It was cool. Okay. So anyway, that's an idea about a thing that we found. So there's the part that's about syntax and stuff. But so going back to kind of like the big theoretical questions about, okay, what are these different cognitive mechanisms, these domain general things, these language specific things? What are the things that explain sentence processing differences? It's like, well, we didn't get as far as we wanted in answering these questions because we were dealing with these measurement questions. And so this has just made me very interested in measurement questions. I'm still interested in syntactic questions and just general sentence processing. But yeah, the measures, we need them. So interested in that. So I'll just tell you a little bit, this is kind of the last thing I'll talk about, just a little bit about things I'm currently working on. So I mentioned that I'm interested in language experience, like how much people read, how much they're exposed to, what kind of stuff they're exposed to and stuff. But language experience itself is kind of like a, hard, it's a fuzzy, the opposite of hard. It's a fuzzy concept, and there are lots of different ways of measuring it. One of the ways of measuring print exposure, so an aspect of language experience, is with what's called the author recognition test. And this is where you look at a list of names and you have to find all of the names that are actually names of authors of books that you recognize, and you get punished. Not really, your points get penalized if you circle people that aren't actually authors. And so you get the score that's supposed to kind of map on to like, okay, you generally know about books, so like probably you read a lot, and it predicts stuff like vocabulary size and stuff. So I did a project about that measure, about the best way of presenting that measure, whether you should like present one name at a time versus presenting them all at once, particularly if you're trying to move your studies online, which a lot of us are doing right now because we can't run people in person. So I'm going to talk about that project at Psychonomics, which is also virtual. So if you're going to Psychonomics, you can visit my virtual poster about that project. I can also answer questions about it if people are like really interested in that particular task. I also have a parallel line of work looking at individual differences in predicting sentence processing, but instead of looking at reading and syntax, I'm looking at the visual world and people making predictions about what is going to be named. And so I've been working on writing up this particular manuscript that has a similar kind of flavor of what I just told you about. But I'm also working on kind of looking at the visual world paradigm as a potential measure of individual characteristics. And so if we thought of it that way, because it's a place where we track people's eyes and we have them do different conditions and then look at differences in the eye movement record based on the different conditions. It involves averaging around a lot of eye movement measures are very noisy. So it seems like it's kind of maybe a bad candidate for using it as a measure of individual differences, because it's easily manipulated and all these things I talked about of being like squarely in the experimental world. But it also has a lot of potential for being a good measure of individual differences. You can measure lots of different kinds of people using eye tracking because it doesn't require people to like read things. They can just like look at pictures of things while they listen to things. And it's like not that taxing and all these things. So I'm working on that by just like trying to measure the reliability of different aspects of the eye movement record. That project is currently on hiatus because I can't track people's eyes right now. And then also I'm involved in a project looking specifically at reading experience as a predictor of syntactic processing, but with people who are not college people who are school-aged people. And so that's led by Dwayne Watson and some of his colleagues at Vanderbilt in education. And it's cool, but it's also challenging because it involves individual differences. But I still think, it's worth doing. It's just tricky. That's the take home. Okay, that's all. So thank you. Here's how to contact me. Here's my email address. I do technically have a Twitter, and so like if you tag me in things on Twitter or like ask me a question on Twitter, I will see that. But I pretty much never post anything, so I'm not that fun to follow. And that's all. So I'm gonna, I think, close my slides, but I could open them again for questions, but I'm gonna just for right now stop. Okay, now I'm looking at you again.
Great, thanks so much. Let's thank our speaker, everyone.
Thank you for listening.